So,
restart.
okay, so I'm going to be discussing our observation of stationary spontaneous Hawking radiation and the time evolution of an analog black hole. So this is an experimental observation of spontaneous Hawking radiation and in an analog system. And our work builds upon a rich theoretical history. I realize that, just a second. Okay, I realize that for this audience, perhaps this introduction is unnecessary, but I'll go through it anyway in case there are some people who are not such experts. So it began with Bekenstein, who predicted that a black hole should have both entropy and temperature. Hawking then said that a black hole should radiate at the very temperature predicted by Bekenstein. And in doing that, he combined general relativity with quantum field theory. So this is considered a first step towards achieving a theory of quantum gravity, or choosing the best theory of quantum gravity, I guess. And Hawking came up with the formula that the Hawking temperature is proportional to the surface gravity. And he also said that the Hawking radiation should be stationary like a black body. So the black hole should be radiating like an ordinary black body. So the thermality of Hawking radiation immediately leads to the information paradox. Although the thermality should be limited by gray body factors at the very least. Furthermore, the Hawking radiation should be very weak. It's very difficult to see, perhaps very, very difficult to see Hawking radiation from a real black hole because the Hawking temperature is so low. But perhaps one can find very small black holes which would have higher Hawking temperature. So perhaps primordial black holes were created in the early universe, or maybe black holes could be found at the LHC. In 1981, Bill Unruh came up with the idea of analog black holes, where sound plays the role of light. And he came up with the same formula for the Hawking temperature, but where G is the analog of the surface gravity and C is the speed of sound. And in his paper, he wrote, black hole evaporation is one of the most surprising discoveries of the past 10 years. So at that time, Hawking's prediction was very surprising, apparently, and he invented the idea of an analog black hole to try and check this surprising prediction. So there have been many systems proposed as analog black holes. For example, Bose-Einstein condensates, which is what I'll be discussing today. And there are many articles discussing this. Also, superfluid helium-3 has been proposed as an analog black hole, electromagnetic waveguides, ultra-cold fermions, rings of trapped ions, superconducting circuits, light in nonlinear liquids, exciton-polariton condensates, magnons in a magnetic wire, and Weil semimetals. From the experimental side, my group has been studying this problem for the past 12 years. And we've made a systematic study, starting with creating analog black holes, and then learning to observe the small populations of phonons in the condensate, since our Hawking radiation is phonons. Then in 2014, we saw stimulated Hawking radiation. And then in the last 3 articles, we've been studying spontaneous Hawking radiation. Another area of active study is surface waves in water. And we heard Silke's talk where she discussed these surface waves, and one can see this classical stimulated effect where surface waves hit the horizon and stimulate pairs. Another area of active study is the nonlinear optical fibers, where they also saw the classical stimulated effect. Also, exciton-polariton condensates are under study. Here's a picture of our analog black hole. So what you're seeing here, the white and gray is the atoms. And this is, what you're seeing is about 8,000 atoms, and it's 0.1 millimeters long. And this is a Bose-Einstein condensate. It's extremely cold, less than a nanokelvin, colder than the typical Bose-Einstein condensate. And it's a sort of a pencil-like geometry. So it's confined to this very narrow sort of tube, and created by a laser beam. And the condensate is flowing from left to right. So in this region, where the high density region is, the condensate is flowing slowly, more slowly than the speed of sound. Whereas here, the condensate is flowing faster than the speed of sound here in the low density region. So here, where the condensate is flowing faster than the speed of sound, if you imagine a sound wave traveling against the flow from right to left, it can't go forward in the laboratory frame because the flow is faster than the speed of sound. So it can't reach this point, which is the analog of the horizon. And so it's as if it's trapped inside a black hole. So that's the analogy. A phonon on this side can go forward because this flow is slower than the speed of sound. So that's outside the black hole. So now here in the inside region, there's a big Doppler shift in the laboratory frame on this wave, which is traveling against the flow. And the Doppler shift is so large that the frequency is negative in the laboratory frame. So the energy of the phonon is negative in the laboratory frame. Whereas on this side, with the slower flow, the energy is positive. So you could have a pair with zero total energy, and this is Hawking radiation. So here's an experimental diagram of how we trap this pencil-like condensate. So here's this Bose-Einstein condensate. There's a laser focused, and creates an attractive potential for the atoms because the laser is red detuned relative to the atomic resonance, which implies that it's attractive for the atoms. It reduces the energy of the atoms to be inside of this beam. So that's how we trap them. Then there's an imaging laser, which comes from above. Due to the index of refraction of the atomic sample, the cloud, the imaging laser gets a phase shift. And this is the phase shift which we image with a high resolution lens onto the camera. So we're seeing the phase shift. Now, however, this trapping laser is very weak because we want low density. It increases the signal of Hawking radiation. So the trapping laser is not strong enough to hold the condensate against gravity. So we have a coil, a magnetic field gradient, which counteracts gravity. So here's a picture of the experimental apparatus, the experimental area, where the condensate is right around here. So here, I'll put this picture here where you can, this is the elongated condensate, and here's the focused laser beam coming in from here. You could also see all these air tubes, these paper tubes. And these paper tubes, the point of them is to prevent the motion of air from disturbing the laser beam, because the condensate is so cold that any motion of the laser beam will heat the condensate up. Now, I mentioned that the condensate is flowing from left to right, and here it starts flowing faster than the speed of sound. That's achieved by a density, by a potential step. So the condensate flows over this step and gets accelerated to supersonic speeds. Now this step is created by another laser beam. This is actually a Gaussian laser beam coming out at us, but it's been cut in half by a knife edge and then imaged onto the atoms. So this knife edge, there's a very sharp transition from the light to the darkness, to no laser beam. And so if the atoms come out of this beam, they lose a lot of energy because this is a repulsive laser beam because it's blue detuned relative to the atomic resonance. So atoms coming out of the beam will obtain a large amount of energy as if they've gone over a potential step. Then this laser beam is moved to the left with a constant velocity. Now, if we go into the reference frame where the beam is stationary, it's as if the condensate is moving to the right and flowing over this step and being accelerated to supersonic speeds. So here's here's the condensate inside of its vacuum chamber. And here are some lenses which focus this sort of image this laser beam, this half Gaussian laser beam onto the condensate to make this potential step. And that comes in here from this side. Now, somewhere else in the imaging system, there's a mirror which can rotate and shift move this beam and cause it to sweep along the condensate, as we said, which creates the effective flow of the condensate over the edge of the potential. Here's another view of a farther, more distant view of the experiment. Here's what we saw, or what we just saw is in this region here. You could see all this optics, all these mirrors and lenses. These are used for the laser cooling, which is the first stage of the cooling of the atomic cloud. Here's another view of this apparatus. And you can see all these mirrors for the laser cooling. Another view. This is the vacuum chamber. The lasers go into these windows to cool the cloud. Here's the lower level. It's sort of a two-level. We were seeing the upper level. Down here in the lower level, you see a lot of the optics for the imaging with all these air tubes. Here's another table which just has lasers on it, and they go over to the experiment by optical fibers. So now what we'd like to do now is to start looking at the Hawking radiation. The first thing is to see the predicted Hawking temperature. We have this formula for the Hawking temperature given by the surface gravity. So we want to see the analog of the surface gravity. So the analog of the surface gravity is given by the derivative of the velocity, the gradient of the velocity and the speed of sound evaluated at the horizon. So here's the overall potential where we have the laser beam trapping the atoms as a function of position. So the laser beam trapping the atoms plus the potential step. So the atoms are sitting in this minimum and they flow over this step because in the reference frame of the step, this minimum is moving to the right. So the atoms flow over the step and are accelerated to supersonic speeds. So here's a density profile. So we can take this image and integrate it vertically and get a density profile. So you see this large peak, that's the condensate sitting in the minimum. And then over here, these are the supersonic moving part of the condensate, the part which is flown over the step. So this is the horizon, the boundary between the sort of stationary, the slowly moving condensate and the supersonic part of the condensate. So this is the horizon here. And we want to evaluate the derivative of the velocity, flow velocity and speed of sound here. Well, from the density, we could compute the speed of sound. So we could compute, take this profile and convert it to a speed of sound profile and evaluate the second term. To get the first term, what we do is we assume a constant current. So the density times the flow velocity is a constant. So we can convert the derivative of the velocity to a derivative of the density. So we end up with this expression for the Hawking temperature, where we're going to take the derivative of both the density and the speed of sound. The density is shown in this plot, and we get the predicted Hawking temperature. So we can do this at the various times. These profiles are all at various times. So if we do that, we get this plot. So here's time. Here's the log of the Hawking temperature. So the blue points are the predictions that we were just discussing from the surface gravity. And we can see that the predicted Hawking temperature is essentially constant for a long time and then goes down at the latest times. So this is different from a real black hole where the predicted Hawking temperature increases with time as the black hole evaporates. So now we'd like to actually observe the Hawking radiation and see what its temperature is and see if it agrees with the prediction from the surface gravity. So we're imagining that this point here, the horizon, should be emitting pairs of density waves, a Hawking particle traveling out of the black hole and the partner falling into the black hole. So to actually observe this, but these will be very, very weak density fluctuations. So here's the density profile. We're expecting there to be some extremely weak density waves going in and out. And so now in order to see that, we follow the suggestion in the literature. We repeat the experiment thousands of times and compute the correlation function between pairs of points. So we, for example, we'll consider a point X, which is outside the black hole, and X prime, which is inside the black hole. And these points should be correlated as if they're equal propagation times from the horizon. So the horizon is emitting these pairs, and that causes a density correlation between X prime and X if they're equal propagation times. And it doesn't matter if they're close to the horizon or far from the horizon, as long as they're equal propagation times. So we expect, if we plot the correlation function as a function of X and X prime, we expect a band of points. Each point on the band is a pair of values of X and X prime, which are equal propagation times from the horizon. So we're going to look for this band in the correlation function. And there's an article, these correlations are negative. If we take the profile of this correlation band, it's negative. Here, it goes to negative values. So we're seeing negative correlations between the inside and outside of the black hole. We could understand from this article that these negative correlations imply that the Hawking radiation is carrying positive mutual information between the inside and outside of the analog black hole. So now we'll repeat the experiment thousands of times at various times after the formation of the horizon, and we get these correlation pictures. And you could see in most of these correlation diagrams, the band of this gray band starting from the middle and going up to the left. And these are the correlations between the Hawking and partner particles. And all these correlation functions together is a total of 97,000 repetitions of the experiment, which corresponds to 124 days of continuous measurement. Now, we're going to focus here on these 6 pictures. This is the spontaneous period of Hawking radiation. And in all of these correlation functions, you could see this band. Here, this image up here, this correlation function up here is the average of these 6 plots. And you could very clearly see this band of spontaneous Hawking radiation, the correlations between the Hawking and partner particles. Now, we want to convert this into a temperature. We want to extract from these correlation functions a temperature to compare with the surface gravity. So we showed in our work that we can merely take the Fourier transform of this band. This is in position space as a function of X. We could take the Fourier transform of the band to go to K space and then ascribe a temperature to it. But instead of showing you the mathematics, I'm going to give you an intuitive picture. So the deeper the band is, the more the Hawking radiation. So that means if there's deeper band, that means more correlations. That means that there was more Hawking radiation to cause these correlations, and more Hawking radiation corresponds to a higher temperature. So we could ascribe to the depth of this band a temperature. And that gives us these green points. You could say it's due to the quantity of Hawking radiation. We can extract a temperature from the quantity of Hawking radiation. And we see in the spontaneous period, the blue points, it is in agreement with the green points. So the quantity of Hawking radiation is in agreement with the prediction due to the surface gravity. Another way that we can extract a temperature from this is the width of the band. The narrower the width, that implies shorter wavelengths. And shorter wavelengths implies higher temperatures. So from the width of the band, we could also get a temperature. That gives us these red pluses are the temperature due to the width. And they're also in rough agreement with the blue points, which is from the surface gravity. So we see that we have the spontaneous Hawking radiation has the quantity predicted for spontaneous Hawking radiation, as well as the spectral width. And the fact that the quantity agrees with the width implies that the spectrum is thermal, where a thermal spectrum has a certain width and it's commensurate with the height of the spectrum. So another thing that we can see is that this is all approximately stationary during the spontaneous period. The curve's not particularly going up or down. So we see that we have spontaneous Hawking radiation, it's thermal and it's stationary, and it agrees with the blue curves. It's at the predicted Hawking temperature. So this basically confirms Hawking's semi-classical calculation. So in all of its aspects. Now, however, if we look to earlier times, we see that the surface gravity is still about the same. However, the quantity of Hawking radiation is very low. So this is sort of strange. We have a semi-classical black hole with a surface gravity. The black hole, the analog black hole is already formed, but there's little or no Hawking radiation. So this seems very strange, but fortunately there's this dashed theoretical curve, which seems to agree with the data. So that gives us hope that there's some explanation. And this dashed curve corresponds to a real black hole, the gravitational collapse of a cloud of dust. So we've chosen a real black hole with 170 solar masses to correspond to our Hawking temperature. And it's in this article, they calculate how this black hole collapses and the flux of Hawking radiation, which is emitted, and also as a function of time. So if we assume a Stefan-Boltzmann law, that this flux of Hawking radiation is proportional to the Hawking temperature to the fourth power, we could extract the temperature for this collapsing cloud of dust. And that gives us that gives this dashed curve, which agrees nicely with the data. So this is a nice coincidence that our observation agrees with the prediction for a real collapsing black hole. So now, another thing that we can say about the spontaneous period is that it lacks dispersion. The dispersion relation for a Bose-Einstein condensate is not linear. It's superluminal. And here's a theoretical prediction from this article, where you can see that there are these extra fringes in the correlation function. These are due to the dispersion. And we don't see any evidence for these fringes. So we see that dispersion doesn't seem to be playing a role in the experiment. Now, at later times, at the end of the spontaneous period, an inner horizon forms in this black hole. So real black holes should have inner horizons if they have charge or if they're rotating. So our black hole also has forms an inner horizon. So I'll explain what an inner horizon is in our case. So we said that the black hole, the condensate flows over the potential step and then but then after it flows over, it goes uphill and it will eventually slow down again. So we could see here in the density profile, it flows over the potential step and is accelerated. Here's the supersonic region. But here it's slowed down again below the speed of sound. At this blue point, it's gone below the speed of sound again. And so you're sort of going outside of the black hole. Here you could see plots. We plot the velocity and the speed of sound. The velocity here is the black curve, and the speed of sound is the gray curve. The velocity is higher than the speed of sound, whereas over here, the velocity goes lower than the speed of sound again. And that's the inner horizon, is the point where the flow velocity slows down again. So we could look at the dispersion relation. So here's outside the black. So here's the condensate flowing over the step. Outside the black hole, you have the usual dispersion relation of a Bose-Einstein condensate. It's superluminal. Here are the Hawking particles. The dispersion relation has a negative slope, meaning that particles are moving from right to left. They're moving away from the horizon, the Hawking particles. Here, inside the black hole, the dispersion relation looks like this. It's not linear. again, due to the nonlinear dispersion relation of a Bose-Einstein condensate. Here are the partners. They have a positive slope. So that means that they're moving from left to right. They're falling into the black hole. However, the dispersion relation curves over. And so when here, the dispersion relation has a negative slope, meaning that again, the waves are moving from inside outside. So due to the nonlinear, the superluminal dispersion relation of a Bose-Einstein condensate, there are waves, particles which can travel from the inner horizon out to the outer horizon and hit the outer horizon. And they stimulate additional Hawking radiation. So we could consider this point on the dispersion relation. This is the point with zero frequency. Omega has come down to zero here. So zero frequency, these waves can be created for free. It's an instability. And they will move out and hit the horizon. Furthermore, this inner horizon is moving. So these waves acquire a non-zero frequency in the reference frame of the outer horizon. They have zero frequency, but that's in the reference frame of the inner horizon, which is moving. So the waves hit the outer horizon with a positive frequency. I'm sorry, with a negative frequency and stimulate Hawking radiation. So we can see that here. We have here, this is the stimulated period, the multi-mode stimulated period, we call it. And you could see, we'll zoom in on that. You could see that the Hawking radiation is much stronger than the spontaneous Hawking radiation. This is due to this stimulation. However, we see that it's still single multi-mode, as in the Hawking radiation has some thermal distribution. Also here, it's a distribution of modes. It's not a single mode. We can compare, a single mode would have sort of a sinusoidal pattern. We could see that by doing an experiment where we're going to create pairs. So we said that the condensate flows over this step, will cause this step to oscillate. When we do that, we see that we cause the horizon to emit pairs of waves, and we get a correlation function which looks like these correlation functions here with all these sinusoidal patterns as the horizon emits these pairs of waves. So we know what a single frequency mode looks like. It looks like a sinusoidal pattern in the correlation function. And here in this stimulated Hawking radiation doesn't show this sinusoidal pattern. So it's multi-mode. So here in this multi-mode period, the quantity of Hawking radiation is going way up above the spontaneous prediction. And also the width is narrowing because this stimulation is a single frequency. So as the time goes on, it becomes more and more monochromatic. Now, if we look at the latest times, zoom in on these latest times, we start to see this monochromatic pattern. So this is the monochromatic stimulated Hawking radiation. And you could see it's become extremely strong. The scale is no longer 0.1, it's now up to 4. So the stimulation has caused very strong Hawking radiation. And here you could see that the extremely strong Hawking radiation, and it's becoming extremely narrow, and the spectrum is extremely narrow. We can rule out black hole lasing. There's another type of stimulated Hawking radiation called black hole lasing. In that case, the partner particles bounce off the inner horizon and come back and stimulate additional Hawking radiation. And they bounce back and forth, the partners, between the two horizons, stimulating more and more Hawking radiation. This process would be stochastic because the partners are created, spontaneous partners are created stochastically. So this phenomenon we would see even if there were only stochastic fluctuations. However, the process which we discussed, where the inner horizon emits the waves, that's a deterministic process. So one would be, in a sense, it shouldn't even appear in the correlation function at all. If it's deterministic, something deterministic doesn't appear in the correlation function. It's the same for every realization of the experiment. However, it's explained in this article that slight variations in the experiment from run to run will allow even a deterministic process to appear in the correlation function. So we're going to differentiate between what we see and black hole lasing by checking to see if it's deterministic or not. And we'll do that with a simulation. We'll simulate stochastic and we'll also simulate deterministic, and we'll see which one looks like the experiment. So here's quantum fluctuations only. So this is stochastic. And in the late times, you don't see anything like the experiment. Whereas if you add these variations in the experiment, where a deterministic process can appear in the correlation function, you do see something like what we saw in the experiment. So we thus conclude that the experiment, these waves are deterministic, and they are therefore not lasing. They're this other type of stimulation where the waves are emitted by the inner horizon. So in conclusion, the spontaneous Hawking radiation is seen to be stationary and thermal at the correct temperature. And we show 6 independent measurements of the Hawking radiation during this period. So thus, the semi-classical regime of Hawking radiation has been verified in an analog black hole, which confirms Hawking's calculation. And we also see stimulated Hawking radiation. Now, what are the implications of this for real gravity? The reason that I like to study analog gravity is to learn something about real black holes. Now we see that Hawking radiation is indeed stationary, as predicted by Hawking, which verifies the correspondence with black body radiation. Furthermore, we see that the Hawking radiation is indeed thermal, and this is the basis of the information paradox. So in our system, which is semi-classical, we see that it really does exhibit thermal Hawking radiation. And so there really is a information paradox which should be solved by quantum gravity or some other explanation. Furthermore, the temperature that we see that the Hawking temperature is the correct temperature, and that provides a link with black hole entropy, because Bekenstein came up with that same temperature due to considerations of entropy. We also see that the correlations between the Hawking and partner modes are of the predicted magnitude with no reduction due to the underlying quantum structure. In other words, our analog black hole also has some analog quantum gravity. It has some underlying quantum structure. And this quantum structure does not somehow destroy the correlations, as was predicted for certain models for real black holes, of quantum gravity effects for real black holes. So thank you. That's the end of the talk.
Thank you very much. Very nice talk.
Thanks.
So the now session is open for questions and comments.
Okay.
Any questions? Okay. Yes, from Jiameng.
Hello, Jeff.
Hi.
I would like to know, how do you interpret the upper right correlation in your correlation maps? We see some, yes, this part.
It's a very good question.
What is
yes,
this?
You know, it's a very good question. I only noticed recently, we can basically, these lines here, you could see these sort of curves here.
Yes.
They correspond to correlations between the modes which are the partners which are falling into the black hole, and the modes which are directed into the black hole. A partner, you could say, is a mode which a real black hole also has this. The partners are directed out towards the horizon, whereas there are also modes which are directed in, which are trivially going into the black hole. They're propagating towards the middle of the black hole. You have a light cones. You have two different directions. So these are correlations between the partners and those modes, which are also produced correspondingly with the Hawking, a little bit produced with the Hawking radiation, which are directed inward.
This is one scenario, and I agree with this. There is another scenario, which I will submit to you. Imagine that your horizon is fluctuating because it is unstable. You will emit some waves, and these waves will also populate the correlations because they are entrained by the flow. So my question is, are you sure that in your system, all your horizons and the effective space-time is fully stationary?
Okay, well here,
everywhere.
In this picture, there is no inner horizon yet. So there's only one horizon.
Yes, so for the black hole horizon.
And yes, and this black hole horizon, we see that the Hawking radiation is stationary because by the quantity of Hawking radiation. So we see that it's spontaneous. I'm sorry, spontaneous by the quantity of Hawking radiation. We see this is in precise agreement. We showed in this graph with the blue circles and the green circles. There's a agreement. So that's how we know that we have this negligible sort of Hawking radiation due to other sort of noise or stimulation or something.
And I have a second question. It seems that in your plot of the V and C versus X, you have a third horizon, a black hole horizon. Can you comment on this?
First of all, yes.
Yes.
Right there.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you have a cavity.
I'm sorry, what?
You have a cavity. You have a white hole horizon or inner,
yes.
You call it inner horizon, I call it white hole horizon on the left. And you have one, and you have on the right, a black hole horizon, another one.
First of all, I don't know what this does. If we don't see any particular effect of this extra horizon, I guess what we would look for, this would be a black hole horizon. We'd be looking for Hawking radiation over here.
Yes.
Have I really looked very carefully? I mean, the Hawking temperature is not very high.
Okay.
I haven't studied. Also, I have another thing to say about this. These plots are qualitative only. In order to get these V versus C, it's subject to all sorts of errors. So one should not really be, say, taking these values to they just show qualitatively that as time goes on, this horizon forms. Probably this inner horizon is really there is really another horizon there, but I'm not too sure about it. But I haven't studied it very carefully, this extra horizon.
Thank you, Jeff. It was very interesting.
You're welcome. Great.
Any other questions or comments? Actually, I have a question. So about this ramp up phase. So you mentioned that this can be explained by gravitational collapse. And is it accidental or is there a good reason? Why?
I've seen no theoretical prediction that our black hole would somehow be like a collapsing cloud of dust. So I have no reason to think that there's any simulation, anything. Yeah, I unfortunately I don't have any interesting to say.
That phase depends on the initial condition, or how sensitive it is to the choice of initial condition.
Wow. Okay. Well, we only have one set of data.
Oh, okay.
So you're basically asking, this. Let's see if I could get back to these 3 points. If we change the experiment slightly, how much would these 3 points change? I don't know.
I see. Probably you expect that the late time behavior doesn't depend on the initial condition too much.
Oh, okay. Here you mean like the spontaneous period?
Right. Hopefully.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there are some people who like to write papers about no hair theorems for analog black holes. And you can say that the black hole is going to want to go to this sort of stationary configuration where the flow velocity and the speeds of sound meet some stationary criteria for stationary flow. So you could say that it's sort of attracted to this, the flow velocity and speed of sound. So one would expect this would be sort of independent of what happened at very early times.
I see. Oh, very interesting.
Yeah.
But
Thank you very much.
can I say something?
Yes, please.
Yeah, but I think that the very graph that you're showing, Jeff, is telling you
Yes.
that, because you see in the spontaneous Hawking radiation, what you see is basically that you are your spectrum is basically fixed by the surface gravity. That
Yes.
is another way to say that there are no other scales that are dominant there, in spite of the fact that instead they are relevant. Probably the initial conditions are definitely relevant in the ramp-up phase, and I would
Yes.
say also probably later on. So in that regime, in the spontaneous Hawking radiation, somehow you can reverse the things and say that it's a kind of Neuer theorem, in the sense that only the surface gravity works. The fact that only the surface gravity is determining that, and that you have the notion of temperature, and basically it's telling you that it is being enforced, a form of Neuer, just for that phase at least.
That's a better answer. Yeah. So we see that everything agrees with the surface gravity. So apparently the surface gravity determines everything, and that's all you need to know is the surface gravity.
Yeah, thank you.
Which is remarkable. If you think the complication of the fact that this is an actual experiment is quite remarkable.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's thank Jeff
Thanks.
again.